This program is part of Lift Every Voice, Why African American Poetry Matters, a national public humanities initiative of Library of America presented in partnership with the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, with generous support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and Emerson Collective. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Black Poetry Fest, a series of virtual programming brought to you by Fulton County Library and Lift Every Voice, a series of programs by Library of Americas. Today, we are very excited to talk with Malcolm Tariq. So to begin, we're going to start with a reading of a poem from the collection African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, edited by Kevin Young. This book is the companion to the programming from Library of Americas. So if you're really looking for a source to find out more about the history of Black poetry in America, this is a great place to start. First, we're going to read a poem by Jericho Brown, and it's called Prayer of the Backhanded. Not the palm, not the pear tree switch, not the broomstick, nor the closest extension cord, not his braided belt, but God, bless the back of my daddy's hand, which, holding nothing tightly against me and not wrapped in leather, eliminated the air between itself and my cheek. Make full this dimpled cheek, unworthy of its unfisted print, and forgive my forgetting the love of a hand, hungry for reflex, a hand that took no thought of its target, like hail from a blind sky, involuntary, fast, but brutal in its bruising. Father, I bear the bridge of what might have been a broken nose. I lift to you what was a busted lip. Bless the boy who believes his best beatings lack intention, the mark of the beast. Bring to life the son who glories in the sin of immediacy, calling it love. God, save the man whose arm, like an angel's invisible wing, may fly backward in fury, whether or not his son stands near. Help me hold in place my blazing jaw as I think to say, excuse me. In this poem, Jericho Brown prays in a space between pain and humility. As the speaker endures the suffering put upon him, he lifts his voice to the divine and finds himself wholly at the mercy of the higher power to redeem himself and heal the hurt within. Malcolm's work also feels like prayer. His poems come as they are and seek out a meaning in suffering, the redeemable in the forgotten, and find strength where others see weakness. In this way, both poets make use out of their pain and come closer to a peace through poetry. I hope you enjoy our interview with Malcolm, and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, Fulton County. We are here with Malcolm Tariq for the first installment of Black Poetry Fest. We're super excited to have a Georgia native, a official Georgia peach who's left the city, but we're really excited to hear his work. I'm going to read his bio and a little introduction, and then we're going to hear some great poems. Malcolm Tariq is a poet and playwright from Savannah, Georgia. He is the author of Heed the Hollow, winner of the Cave Canem Poetry Prize, and the 2020 Georgia Author of the Year Award in Poetry. He was a 2016-2017 playwriting apprentice at Horizon Theater Company and is a 2020-2021 resident playwright with Liberation Theater Company. Malcolm is a graduate of Emory University and holds a PhD in English from the University of Michigan. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, where he is the Programs and Communications Manager at Cave Canem, a home for Black poetry. Malcolm's poems take the reader to church and the club at the same time. The poems are places to celebrate, grieve, find quiet, and reflect. The body is seen as both beautiful and tragic. The reader finds themselves in the heart of the work. It becomes a place of solace and jubilance. With Malcolm's poems, we can immerse ourselves into our spiritual wholeness and find space for poetic liberation. Without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Malcolm.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was, I wasn't expecting the personal introduction. That's really cool. Okay, I'm gonna read from the book, Heath the Hollow. I'm just gonna take us through some poems. So this first one is called Power Bottom. In church, we said, Satan, get thee behind, and I always laughed. A demon child with a twisted mouth. At supper time, I refused meat to suck on bones. In the alley behind the house, what grew besides berries, I was told not to touch. I licked the blood at the root. A bitter crop, I came screaming, never tell me to be quiet again. I know what life the wind sucks, but what hits harder than a hungry hand scorned by a gallant South? I wanted to try me. Trust me, you've never felt a mouth this sweet, this thorny. They said somebody put sugar in his tank. I thought myself an army. Commander, when I tell you to f me, I don't mean for your tree to drop in a spirit-filled chamber of burning flesh. I mean, grow a thicker root. I mean to say, crow me. Too much sweetness can kill you, and this plantation can never be too used. In the end, I will have you hung up, trapped in my southern breeze. I think next I'll read a poem that for some reason I don't usually read, but I'm gonna read it because this poem actually was inspired by a trip to the library. I was at Emory working on my dissertation, and I was writing this book at the same time. And so I would take breaks by writing these poems. And I was looking for something else, like in the reference section, like near the encyclopedias. And there was this book called Index to the American Slave. And so it was just a catalog of like different enslaved people and like where they were from, who owned them, who interviewed them for this project. So yeah, I forgot all about that story, but seeing you in the library reminded me of this poem. And so it's called Index to the American Slave. Also, this is for like white people. Sometimes they'll, in groups, like they'll talk about where their family's from, and then they'll turn to the Black person and be like, oh, where's your family from? And you're like, guess. So this is called Index to the American Slave for whites who somehow have asked. Nestled among books, the spine bleeds restraint. I attempt my chances, finding but row upon row of property labeled, a record sorted by interviewer, master, narrative state. Whose story is it? How many ways do you find yourself here? Names tied to antithesis. How many ways do I find myself thus far, still waiting, and though located, not found? The deep root clenched to dirt. Its blood, root deep but unnameable, save the stock our kin. Let the record show we cannot call our names without uttering yours. The mess of your lives stuck between our teeth. Let the record show we still lurk in branches your family trees denied us, hanging in the balance, blood-thirsty leaves, cataloged in that way are not names. This poem is the title poem of the book, which is called Heath the Hollow. I want to remember everything that has happened to me, history of my flesh, scar of her miscarriage. I take my own pills as I once learned to sign for my mother's birth control, preventative measures. I am learning to reproduce myself with the shape of my mouth's consuming. I'll swallow everything. I have to forget to live the way men read labels as invitations. I've heard women in my family talk of assault as I've heard men talk of assaulting. I'll be something to someone someday or nothing but spill. Truth be told, I want to be the last side effect in the disease. I'll settle for a curse. I'm trying to remember to forget the colonizer's name on my medical chart, scripting my back. I straighten into narrative and carry it in spite of my name, how he grabs me as if prescribed. I want to forget the way he's had me over the counter taking him, the way he told me you were almost a power bottom. And I'll read two more. Um, yeah, so this one is called On Sullivan's Island, and Sullivan's Island is in Charleston. Um, I was doing a research trip in Charleston for this book, and I'm from Savannah, and Charleston is really close to it's 2 hours away, but they're like sister cities. And Charleston's are really, like Savannah, really historical, but they do a really great job, better than Savannah, of documenting Black life during slavery. And so I was there, and somehow I found out about Sullivan's Island, and it's also the site that Toni Morrison's A Bench by the Road project. It was the first place where a bench was placed on a site that was significant to slavery in the United States. And Sullivan's Island, I think it's called Fort Moultrie. It's like one of those during the slave trade there's a certain amount of time when ships would come to Sullivan's Island first, and they would quarantine the Black people before they went off to auction. So millions of Black Americans or Black people in the US can trace their lineage back to Sullivan's Island. And so this is a meditation I wrote after going to that site, which is now like, it was then used in like some war. So it's also like a military base. So that's the story that you get. And there's a sign for the site that's significant to slavery. But on Sullivan's Island, I heed a path trodden for me before. I am this impaired, forgetting and forgetting and forgetting. What else is this wave crashing into shore but an attempt to cleave remembrance? Overhead, the dark sky engulfs the low country. Once welcome spot and terror for the ancestors, always a nest for the captors. Now, baby strollers and casual dog walks file before a single marquee meant to hold place for history. Leisure were once labor. What work have I come here to do besides witness? I go from shore to shore seeking clarity, to stand on the threshold of past and present where land and sea court death. I search my mind for what remains of generational sanity. There is nothing but bondage. Ahead, the sign reads, deadly currents, deep holes, and forbids the swim out. I could chase the distance with salt. I could run face forward into what has already claimed me without regret. This ocean swallows the whole of me. I could join it or become another buoy signaling lost. And lastly, I like to end with this one. So the first poem I read was the first poem in the book called Power Bottom, and this is the last poem, which is called Bottom Power, which is, I would call it, it's a praise song. And it encompasses a lot of themes in the book that are related to heritage, the South, queerness, and Blackness. Bottom Power. Praise the bottom of USA, her blood and sweat in spite of death, deep gulf, spinning sea, stretch of moist marsh cultured into giving, whose salt tears trail into the vast forever and unknown. Praise the plush bottom of USA, its tango of fiber, a seat and sanctuary, the soft pull from bowl by hard hands, afterlife living in the leftover lust of pride. Praise the hard bottom of USA, his cane erected woefully in your honor, sweet juice on the chin, the return each year bent on living whose seed lives on in rich rum-filled romance and rife abandon. Praise the soft bottom of USA, her sugar tits still raw with wrought of generations, her cotton gin gyration inflected into the games of children chattering rhymes on the street corner. Praise the sweet bottom of the South, our heft of hollers ringing into present tense, the lift of fists festered into submission, the perverse sway of swamp housing the hush of history, the holler of saltwater cyclones seeing and sealing truth, our tapestry of tabby toppling over as testimony. Praise the black bottom of the black, praise the bottom of the black bottom. Everything lost and lingering, our bone of brick still breaking, our emptiness, our backward lick of life, our distant desire, our queer quiet, our will and want, our silent sighs exalting the cleft clit still singing, the labor of love. Praise the blackest bottom of the bottom, praise the blackest bottom, praise the bottommost black, praise the black, praise the black, praise the bottom, praise the bottom, praise the bottom. Is that good? Okay.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. And then I just love how the beginning of the book is power bottom and the last one's bottom. Those two poems are just so strong. It's such a serve to put them like as a, love that.
Thank you.
I guess thinking about that, and you talked about how that last poem especially picks up different themes in the throughout the book. And what I enjoy as like a queer Black person to see those threads, those voices like overlapping each other so fluidly. How are you thinking about those different identities, those different voices working together? Is it a natural intuitive thing, or is it are you making conscious efforts to be aware of when you're using which?
In terms of the different identities that are at play?
Yeah, how you're playing with your
Oh,
own identities through
oh
a
yeah.
poem, especially one that's that dense with voices.
Yeah, I don't think I've realized this until after I wrote it or towards the end, but though some of the poems are informed by my own experiences, the voice isn't, the I isn't really like me. I think that it's like a collective I. So like in the poem, the George Washington erasure poem, that like is definitely a collective I because it's about George Washington's teeth. So it's like more than one. But also in that poem, Learning to Bottom, maybe I should have read these poems, Learning to Bottom at the end, where it's in 4 sections, each of those things like happened to me. But I don't think I was writing from a place of like me. And so it helped to not really envision myself as the subject, to really get at a unifying experience or history, because the book is so historical. I think that, I mean, I have a history, I have a heritage, I have like family, you know, but it's also a story that I think I wanted to write it in a way that that people would see themselves in it and not just me. And so those poems that are very specific to like sites, like there's one poem that's about being on Stone Mountain. That was like that was documenting my actual walk up to the top of Stone Mountain, but it's also recognition that it's not only, I'm not the only one that has taken that walk. And so maybe that's a way to like answer the question about how I was dealing with all of those voices, is knowing that, you know, people are complex. And especially because I think one of the themes that started the book was the sexuality piece. And I had just left Ann Arbor, and Ann Arbor was a very weird place to be in your early, was it mid 20s, I guess. So I was in Ann Arbor, and it was like the first place where I like started dating and like being a sexual being with like other people. And Ann Arbor is a very white town, and it's like all this stuff came up, and I was like, oh wow, like there's layers. And it's not just like race, it's also like me being a Southerner. So there's region and there's all this stuff that a lot of people would not understand.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's why I think it's so easy to like the whole time I just know exactly who this speaker is. I'm like, I've been there. Like I get this. Uh, but that's interesting. Like even the sentence, you're like, I was ready to explore like my sexuality, like myself as a sexual person, but the town was white. So I couldn't, like
Mhm.
those things shouldn't work against each other.
Yeah.
Like one's about sexuality, one's about race, but in this space,
Mm-hmm.
uh, like one is limiting the other. And it's the
Exactly.
only way to explain that to someone who doesn't experience that is through um, like poetry can put you in that space of what it feels like. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I love that. And then also kind of also you mentioned that George Washington poem and like George Washington's teeth. Can you explain like my parents don't believe like my family doesn't believe about George Washington's teeth. So you research everything. Explain what's going on with George Washington's teeth with that
George
poem.
Washington's teeth. Okay, so this, what year is this? 2021. So in 20 up until 2018, I haven't checked in like 2 or 3 years, but um, George, there is a section on the Mount Vernon website that talks about his teeth because it's such an issue. So the issue is that when he died, there's a ledger in his inventory that basically he bought teeth from the Black people that he owned.
Mhm.
And George Washington, there's myths that he had wooden teeth, like he was missing a lot of his teeth, like that was just a fact. And so his dentures were either made from like wood or some type of porcelain or somebody else's teeth. And we believe that some of those are from teeth of Black people who he owned. Um, and there's like stories that refute that, or some that are like, this is true. There's also a piece called like the 9 lives of George Washington's teeth, or like the 16 lives of his teeth. It's a very long essay that I have not read, but it's on the internet if your parents want to read it. It's all on the internet.
I was like, why is wooden teeth that much more believable than like that he like teeth from slaves? I was like,
Uh, I mean, I find it very believable. I'm like, well, yeah, that makes sense. The part that I don't believe is that he paid for them. So I'm like, that's the part where I'm like, did you actually give them money or?
the hesitation, not the
Yeah.
where they
Hmm.
came from. Okay, though that's a side note. I'll send that clip to my parents.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in also when you're talking about your voice. I'm thinking a lot about who you're writing for. Like I said, I find a lot of um, refuge in seeing myself in the poems, understanding who the speaker is from personal experience. Uh, it's a two-part question. Like, how are you considering your audience when you're writing? And are you also considering um, people who, I guess if you have an audience, are you aware that there are people who, do you consider that there are people who will be left out, or that there are people who do not share that same connection?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, I think that I am aware that people will not understand either the content or the language that's
Mhm.
happening, but I don't try to let that hinder me. Like I'll have the thought and then I'm like, oh, well, that's not my issue. Like
Yeah.
people write and they don't envision me as the reader.
Mhm.
And so I don't I don't believe that I should try to envision, unless I'm writing for an audience that I know exclusively is not, a Black American audience or a Black audience or an audience in the US or an audience who has knowledge of a certain history. Um, but I don't want, in trying to write to make sure, a universal audience understands it, that really limits what I want to do in the poem. And
Mhm.
so I try not to let that get in the way too much, because people will get it. Also, like, I think when I was there was a note from my editor at one point. He was like, you have to trust your reader. Oh, because I wanted to preface the book with a definition. And he's like, let's put it in the notes and you have to trust that your reader will get there.
Mhm.
And that was such a pivotal moment for me because I have to remember, and especially with poetry, I already know a lot of people are not going to get it. But that's just a part of the journey. If you're willing to like read the entire book, maybe you will. And you know, poetry requires several readings. It's
Yeah.
not like straight on. It does make it worthwhile that once you like read through it, you'll understand once you get to the end. But there's sometimes I'll write and you know there'll be punctuation, everything's in place, and then in the middle there'll be a line with no punctuation and the words seem out of place. And
Mhm.
I always get, you know, these emails that are like, oh, do you mean for there not to be a period right here? Or do you mean for the line to say this thing? And I'm like, yes, I want it.
Yeah.
It doesn't match with the rest, but like that's what it is. Um, and you know, this is even in my playwriting. Like I usually write about life in Savannah. And so I have to find clips for people. These are, you know, Black people from Atlanta, like who don't understand like Savannah speech. Um, so that they can like understand how to deliver the character's voice. But with poetry, I try to stay true to what I want to happen and trust the reader to get there, or they won't get there and they'll be like me when I read Gwendolyn Brooks when I was in high school and I was like, no, not for me. Then 5, 10 years later, I came back, I was like, oh, I see what she's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I imagine, you know.
And I think like when you said it takes more than one visit, like for Gwendolyn Brooks, if you didn't get it initially, you were patient and like went back to it and stuck with it, like how you're hoping people stick through the project to understand um, the
Yeah.
big picture of it.
Hmm.
But I think that's part of what makes your work so powerful is that it is um, speaking to these specific audiences. Um, so yeah, I think that's part of why it resonates so well, but there's also so much there for a general
Hmm.
audience. Um,
Yeah. But I do get comments from people who I read my Goodreads
hmm,
profile reviews, and some people were like, "This is like 2 or 3 books in one. I don't understand." And you know, most of those people are like white people who
yeah,
don't. And I'm like, "Yo, yeah, you don't understand it, but also you're not gonna get it all in one read, and you also have to like liberate your mind from what you're used to. Like every book is different,
yeah.
every project is different. But then even with there is this straight guy, I assume he was straight, who was in Karis bookstore in Atlanta, and
Yeah.
somebody there was like, "Oh, you should read this book," and gave him like my book, which was very surprising. But he read it, and then I think he wrote on Twitter, basically like, "Yeah, I don't really get all of this," and he like gave me some advice, and I was like, "Who are you?"
Like the book's out.
It was cute, but I was like, no. So yeah, I already know that not everyone would get it, and that's fine.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you stuck with your guns.
Mhm.
That's important to do, and it's important like why more books by marginalized people or people whose voices aren't seen in that same respect to like have work out there for people who get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you mentioned your playwriting. Um, the question was like, I guess in your experience of playwriting, especially you research your poems and your plays. There's not all poets are like research based like this. I'm wondering what's the difference in your process? How are you? Do you have different goals when you're writing? I guess you do. I guess you could talk about it. The different goals when you're writing a play versus when you're writing a poem or a book of poems. Um, how does that feel approaching the two?
Yeah. I was just telling some people on this past weekend that I feel more freedom in poetry than I do writing for the stage. Both
Mhm.
of them, there's like endless possibility. But with the stage, obviously, like there's a space. But with poetry, there's like, you know, you can just do whatever. And I'm just also more comfortable in a shorter form. Um, in terms of research, it did like I'm really drawn to history and culture, and coming from Savannah. The example that I like to use is that I'm right now 30, and my brother, this year I'll be 31 and my brother will be 14. So we're like years apart.
Yeah.
And seeing the way that he grew up is much different from the way me and my sister are also 8 years apart. But, you know, we grew up in the same type of like environment, and he was mostly raised without me living at home.
Yeah.
But when I was younger, you know, there were still a lot of older people who lived in my grandmother's neighborhood and community. So we had that history of not just our family history, but how we were connected to the Bligers down the street, Miss Terry around the corner, like all these people and connections and stories that we heard about people who I don't even know. I've never met people who died in like the 70s and 80s. I have all these histories and their stories. Like I had a great aunt who was mixed race. And so the Klan would come through our neighborhood and they would leave her house alone because they thought she was white.
Wow.
But that's a story that my brother like did not hear and would have no context for. And so I think a lot of times when I write, I'm really looking to preserve. That's why this book is so like historical, because I'm looking to preserve history and culture that's like very important for me and the writer I am. Like I read a lot of Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston like in high school. Um, so the research part is very important for a book like this. And then for some of the plays, a lot of them are inspired by true events or true situations. And so wanting to input or know as much as I can so that the piece can really be informed, but to also realize that there's some imagination involved. But as long as I have the true story, or as much as I can, then I can like imagine outside of that or with it if I want to. But the process is mainly the same, I think, in terms of research. It's just going in search of anything that I can find. Um, and then at a certain point, knowing when to stop, because if I don't stop, I will never stop researching. And also, I need to still have my own like opinion and premise for writing instead of just like being locked in a conversation with other people who've done this or primary sources. But yeah, some pieces from this book, The Long Erasure in the Middle, One Yearning, I found that book at the Schomburg Library in Harlem. And then magically it appeared on the street in Brooklyn. Somebody was selling it. It's called like 100 Years of Lynching. Like, why are you selling this book? But I mean, I got a chance to buy it and I didn't have to go all the way up to Harlem anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just usually how it starts, just going. A lot of it is like the library, just seeing what book is on the shelf or if there's an archive. That's why I love going to Emory's library. They have really great archives there.
Yeah, and I'll plug the library. The benefit of when you're going through the shelves, you're searching for maybe one particular book, but everything around it will also be on that subject.
Yeah.
It's such a benefit for someone who's like you, who's willing to just continue to research and pull from various sources. So go libraries. Uh, Also, I like how you said at some point you have to acknowledge that you need to put your own point of view in the work. That it's different than a research project. You're bringing yourself to it.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what really makes someone's work excel and makes it memorable. Um, and then I guess it leans towards a question about, I was like, you clearly identify as a Southern poet. I do too, but if someone asked me what that meant, I would I would have it's a little difficult, but maybe we could talk about what it means to be a Southern poet. And I think the way you talk about, for me, hearing you talk about histories as it relates to space, as it relates to place, uh, and storytelling seems like it's around there. But I was wondering if you could talk about what you think that means, or what does that mean anything, being a Southern poet?
I mean, I do think about this a lot too, but because I mean, on a very literal sense, very, straightforward, literal way, it's, are you from the South? But
What's the
then
first?
when you ask that question, yeah, it's like, well, I was born in the South, but I was raised in New England. So I'm not a Southern poet. But and this has been on my mind because I'm planning a Southern debut reading for Kaveh Khanum. And I asked this writer, I couldn't find anywhere in her bios online and internet interviews where she was from. So I had to DM her on Twitter, like, I'm planning this Southern event. Are you from the South? And she said, well, I was born in New York, but I was raised in the South. So I consider myself a Southern writer, like she's from Atlanta. And that to me is, you're a Southern writer. Even
Yeah.
if you were born somewhere else, so it's a matter of origin, birth, birthplace, or where your formative years, where they were spent. And then I guess also, how are you, what is your canon? Sometimes it's like your
Mhm.
canon. I have a very Southern canon for
Yeah.
myself. Or what are you writing about? So somebody that's from New York, spent their whole life in New York, but writes about the South, is not a Southern writer to me.
Yeah.
I don't accept that. But if you are from, if like I spent all of my 18 years in Savannah, 5 years in Atlanta, 3 years in Michigan, came back to Atlanta for 2 years. So I lived in Georgia like more than 20 years, like most of my life.
Yeah.
Even though I'm in Brooklyn right now, I still heavily identify as a Southern writer. And I think that's really important for me, especially now when, um, and this from Atlanta, like Southern cities are changing so much from people like moving to them, especially Atlanta. And um, just like, what is the South? And every 5 or 10 years is like the new South. And I have some qualms with that as well. Like,
Yeah.
we can't be new all the time. Like, just
Yeah.
because we have new people, like, where is that newness coming from? Or what are you trying to run away from? I lived in DC for a summer, and before I moved back to Atlanta the second time, and my favorite thing was to ask DC and Baltimore people if they thought the area was Southern or Northern,
And I'm
and very different answers
yeah.
all around. And I was like, y'all are Southern. This is the South.
In the South.
Um, yeah, there's a lot of resistance, just because of the South's reputation. But I'm like, the South was only, the history that we talk about. The South was only like the most blatant form, the most
Mhm.
outward of a whole national symptom around racism and violence.
Right.
And people don't want to be connected with that. And that's fine. But wherever anyone is from, like, I bet you there's a history of racial violence, even if it's not
Right.
against Black people. Um, so
And
that's why it's
like
really
you
important to
said,
me
it
to
doesn't have
identify.
to be overt violence, but like, well, there's
Mhm.
the systems are everywhere. So like, how can you?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So that's why it's important for me to be a Southern writer.
yeah, and
What about you? What do you think?
I think, like you said, it's important for both of us to be considered Southern writers because um, I think instead of erasing or like limiting the people's definition of the South, we're enriching it.
Mhm.
And I think that additive way of looking at Southernness is better than like, yeah, better than erasing. It's just
Yeah.
to see how rich that experience is. Like, especially you're from Georgia, Atlanta is different from Savannah, is different from Macon. Like these
Hmm.
places are all a part of it. So to really understand it, uh, it takes a very expansive read to get a feel of what the South is. So
Yeah.
it's important for us to say we're Southern poets so that we're included in that conversation.
Hmm.
Um, Again, especially when you're involving Black people, queer people, um, like
Hmm.
in my knowledge head right now, I'm like the ballroom scene in Atlanta is a lot different than the ballroom scene in New York.
Hmm.
These are different definitions of
Yeah.
Southern. Um,
Yeah, that is. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of times I think people think of the South and Southern as this one thing.
mhm.
And like I cook a lot and I'm really into food, and people think that all Southern food is the same, or they have one definition of gumbo. And I'm like, gumbo is just the one that we all know from like the Bayou area is just
Mhm.
like that is the gumbo, but there's other versions of that throughout the South. Like there's some Southern dishes I've never had.
Right.
Um, Many I did not grow up with. Maybe they were in my family at a certain point, but by the time I came along, like we didn't really do that anymore. And
Mhm.
the same goes for like people's experiences and where they're from. And I think that people saying they're from the South and they're working with are from the South does add to that complexity about like what the region is and has always been.
Yeah.
Not It's not like a new phenomenon.
Yeah. It's not new. It's just more.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm glad you talked about, the next question is about you cooking.
Oh, really?
I was, so I put like watching you cook on Instagram, there's so much, I love watching you cook. But there seems to be like so much love to what you do. There's a knowledge of materials. There's like freedom to improvise. It's like you're playing. There's a sense of gratitude to the ancestors. Like you're acknowledging like these past things. It feels a lot like your poetry, um, in this way. If you could just talk, it's the last question, to just talk about your relationship to cooking. Um,
Yeah.
it's, if y'all are gonna want to go follow Malcolm and then watch these stories, they're so, I mean, I just be like, no one wants to be that guy that's like, ooh, make me a plate. Everyone hates that person, but I'd be like, oh, that looks so good. Uh, but yeah, so, but it feels like your work. So I'm curious of,
Yeah. Oh wow. I love how this the my Insta cooking is like seeping into like these
oh
like
yeah,
poetry conversations. Um yeah, I started cooking. Well, my grandmother has 8 kids on my mom's side. She has 8 kids. So I grew up with a lot of cousins. And so we at least with my my generation, I have cousins who are older than me. Um Definitely my generation, not really my sister's generation, but we grew up having to, there was no babysitters ever. Like we were the babysitters. And so we would have to take care of our younger cousins.
mhm.
Um, so like I knew how to fry fish like in middle school, for example. Like I just knew how to do these things. I did not eat mac and cheese in the box until college. Like I didn't know that that was a real thing. Like I would see it on TV, but I just didn't think in my mind. I don't know what I thought. I was like, people don't know. People surely know that's not mac and cheese. Then when I went to college, people were like, "Oh, you know how to make it without the box?" And I was like, "What do you mean the box?" And then like it's really crazy to me that people talk about box mac and cheese this way. But so then when I went to college, there's this summer where I didn't have a meal plan, and so I had to cook for myself. And so there's a lot of things I knew how to cook, but some things I didn't. So like okra soup, we call it okra soup. I call it low country gumbo. Basically, it's like our version of seafood gumbo. I knew how it tasted and I knew it was in it. And so it was just trial and error until I got it to taste like my grandma's. It wasn't like that much trial and error. It's a very simple thing. But a lot of it is trial and error. I would call my mom and her aunts and be like, yeah, how do you do this thing? Some of it was not like the first time I tried to fry chicken outside of my home was like, nah. But I just did it last week and it was fun. It's like I've been doing it my whole life, which maybe I have. But yeah, it is a way, and I love trying to find like old cookbooks. There's this, my grandma had a couple cookbooks growing up, and one of them was from like, there were these church fundraisers, I think, where people from the church would put together a cookbook and then sell it. And so we had a couple of those. So I like going to used bookstores, cookbook stores, or if like, for example, when I go to Charleston, like getting those cookbooks, or I have a cookbook, it's by my bed, so I'm not gonna get it. But one of them is a cookbook by Princess Pamela, who was from the South but moved to New York
Hmm.
in like, I don't know what years, but definitely around the 60s. And she had a restaurant from her apartment. and she kind of fell into obscurity, but some people found her cookbook and like reprinted it. So I have a copy of her cookbook. I have a cookbook of, it's like recipes from Savannah, like from like the 19th century. And they're also like stories in the cookbook. And so just working with materials, primary source materials like that, and like getting their recipes and then making them in like a more modern way, it's kind of fun for me to experiment with. So, but cooking is that space where it's like, I enjoy doing it because it takes my mind off of a lot of things. It's another way of creating and preserving that history. I've been telling myself that I'm trying to write a cookbook. It's going to be a very slow process, but
Yeah.
I think that I'm doing that now. Yeah, because I'm being more adventurous. I've been like steady cooking for like 10 years. So I think now's the time to like do an assessment of what I've been doing for the past 10 years. But
You're building an audience for it.
did I answer your question? I feel like I was just talking about food.
That's all I wanted. I just wanted.
Okay. And then, I mean, being in New York, one of the challenges when I first moved here 2 years ago was like, where do I find the food I need to find? And in New York, it's like you have to go. There's people say New York, you know, you can find anything you want, and that's true, but it's not going to be easy trying to find it. Oh, you know, like you used to live here, and so
simple
piecing together where I can get, you know, smoked turkey necks from that are cheap and look good, like not the gray ones, like, you know, the ones that look like they're edible, where to find frog legs, where to get trout that's not expensive. It's been 2 years of that. And so that's also the fun part about cooking now, is that like when I find the thing or when I'm in the store and I don't recognize an ingredient, trying to use it. I do this thing now where I go to the farmer's market and pick up something I've never cooked before and then trying to work with it. I got some Spanish black radishes this weekend that I'll probably do something with like duck legs. I don't know, but something's gonna happen.
Yeah. Now I wonder if that how the move affected like how you find your products for food. Has it affected your writing process at all? Being away from I guess where your sources for the South, you knew where that was. I wonder how has it changed at all?
Ooh, I don't think so. I mean, a lot of times, obviously, with writing, I'm like an that's the wrong word to use for this, but I'm a like surroundings place person. I like to post up in a coffee shop. I like to write with other people around me that have nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
And just, you know, seeing interactions, seeing people like on the subway, those type of engagements and writing from there. But also, I mean, growing up in Savannah and living in Georgia for so long, I also just have a wealth of material to draw from. And so even though I'm not like the Emory's library, their like archives are like my go-to place for stuff, just because it's so Southern. They have queer stuff there. It's a place that I return to a lot. I have a lot of notes from my visits there. So now every time I'm in, I feel like Zora Neale Hurston a lot when I go home. It's like me just collecting things so that I can just have material to write about. But I mean, it hasn't really. Also, when I moved here, I had just finished writing this book, so I mean, that's been like almost 2 years, and so there's a handful of poems that I've wrote. Like I haven't written a lot. I wrote one poem that I finished in 2020.
Yeah.
And so it's just been a slow process writing again, but yeah, I think it hasn't changed much.
Yeah, well, that's good. And then, yeah, 2020, it's reasonable that it would be a little slow. So
that too.
Yeah. Well, I think that's our time. If you want to let people know where they can find you, you can
like on the internet?
Yeah, not
Oh.
giving your address. Give me like social media.
Where am I? On Instagram, I'm at Nowhere South. And then Twitter is just my name, Malcolm Tariq. I don't think people my friend laughs at me because I use Facebook. I don't really, it's not that same type of engagement, but I'm on Facebook, but I don't really. do Facebook like that, but definitely Twitter and Instagram.
Yes.
And I'm trying to build a new website. We'll see how that goes.
Good luck. Yeah, that's hard. And then for Fulton County people, Heed the Hollow, I believe it's already in circulation at the library, but feel free to check it out. It's a really incredible project. So with that, I want to thank you, Malcolm, so much for your time. We're happy to kick things off with you. And
yeah, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
yeah, well, I'll see you next time. You got, well, there's a lot of ways. Yeah, I'll see you when I see you.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and we'll see y'all next time.
Thanks.